For much of its history, Hollywood has carefully maintained the illusion that every technique used in filmmaking is harmless tools of artistry meant only to entertain. Yet hidden within the archives are accounts of experiments that veered far beyond conventional craft. Long before digital effects reshaped modern cinema, certain directors ventured into psychological territory, manipulating light, sound, and motion in ways that brushed against the limits of human perception. These methods were never officially outlawed, but they were treated as something far more revealing, techniques too unpredictable, too intrusive, and too influential on the viewer's mind. Some of these experiments targeted the subconscious directly, using frequencies the ear cannot consciously register or flashes the eye barely detects. Others relied on optical distortions that destabilize depth, equilibrium, or the brain's natural sense of timing. In nearly every case, the pattern repeated. A film premiered. Audiences experienced strange physical or emotional reactions. Concerns quietly circulated among studio executives, and the technique vanished without explanation. No press statements, no policy changes, just an unspoken understanding that these methods were best left in the shadows. What makes these forgotten techniques so compelling is not merely their danger, but what they suggest about cinema's untapped potential. These filmmakers discovered how easily the medium could slip into neurological experimentation, how image and sound could shape perception in ways viewers were not prepared for. And once industry leaders realized how deep these effects could reach, they chose silence instead of transparency. In this episode, we revisit 15 sci-fi films that employed methods Hollywood has since avoided, tools capable of bending perception, altering emotional states, or triggering responses the audience never consciously understood. These were not simply stylistic choices, they were sensory experiments conducted in plain sight. And their disappearance raises a question Hollywood has never been willing to answer. Why were these techniques allowed once, and why did they vanish so completely? 1. The Last Starfighter, 1984. The Last Starfighter ushered in a new era of digital imagery, but its pioneering techniques produced unintended perceptual side effects. Early CGI systems lacked the sampling precision needed to handle rapid motion, and as objects moved faster on screen, the render engine introduced motion smear artifacts. Instead of smooth travel, ships and rotating structures momentarily elongated or split into ghosted shapes, creating a non-linear distortion that the brain struggled to reconcile. Viewers in 1984 described a subtle queasiness during high-speed scenes. Some felt as though the image slipped or snapped, breaking the illusion of stability. Technicians investigating these reactions found that the artifacts disrupted motion prediction, a fundamental process the brain uses to maintain spatial orientation. When motion deviated from expected patterns, even for fractions of a second, discomfort followed. Universal Studios reacted quickly. Internal technical reports classified high-velocity rendering as a perceptual hazard, prompting developers to restructure CGI pipelines. Interpolation algorithms were rewritten to eliminate motion smear entirely, even if it meant limiting the kinds of effects animators could achieve. The industry collectively concluded that early CGI had revealed a vulnerability in how the human visual system interprets rapid movement. While modern remasters correct these issues, the original release demonstrated a truth Hollywood rarely acknowledged. Technology evolves faster than the brain's ability to adapt. The Last Starfighter unintentionally crossed into perceptual experimentation, showing how fragile motion continuity can be when digital tools exceed their developmental maturity. Its influence persists not through repetition, but through avoidance. The film's distortions became a boundary marker, a reminder that innovation carries risks when it interferes with the mechanics of human perception. 2. Sunshine, 2007. Sunshine pushed cinematic lighting to unprecedented extremes as it explored humanity's proximity to a dying star. To convey the overwhelming power of the sun, director Danny Boyle used controlled overexposure pulses, bursts of intense brightness that mimicked the shock of facing blinding radiation. These pulses were carefully choreographed to contrast with darker interior scenes, generating abrupt shifts in visual intensity that taxed the viewer's adaptive responses. The impact during early screenings was immediate. Audience members squinted, shielded their eyes, or instinctively leaned back as the pulses hit. Some reported momentary disorientation, as though their vision lagged behind the changes in luminance. Medical consultants noted that the brightness spikes approached thresholds known to cause temporary visual fatigue, especially in darkened environments where the eyes are already dilated. Studio leaders grew cautious. While the overexposure pulses were artistically meaningful, the possibility of triggering discomfort led to concerns about liability and viewer safety. As a result, several sequences were softened before final release, and internal guidelines began discouraging extreme oscillations of brightness in mainstream films. These guidelines did not constitute a ban, but they effectively ended the use of brightness pulsing at the scale sunshine employed. The remaining pulses still communicate the sun's oppressive presence, making the star feel less like a backdrop and more like a hostile entity pressing against the edge of perception. Yet Hollywood's response made clear that this technique carried risks beyond artistic intent. The industry concluded that manipulating light at such intensities could easily cross into territory where visual experience becomes physically taxing. Sunshine's legacy endures as a testament to sensory ambition, one that demonstrated how brightness alone can alter a viewer's emotional and physiological state. Donnie Darko, 2001. Donnie Darko became a cult phenomenon for its cryptic narrative, but hidden beneath its surreal tone was a lesser-known method that subtly manipulated viewers' perception. Director Richard Kelly employed low-frequency brightness fluctuations, micro-adjustments in luminance layered into several key scenes, especially those involving temporal distortion or the appearance of Frank. These fluctuations were not bright enough to qualify as strobe effects, but they created a rhythmic instability that caused the image to feel unsettled, almost as though reality were trembling beneath the surface. Early screening audiences reported sensations that didn't match what they were consciously seeing. Some viewers felt a tightening in their stomach or a faint dizziness during scenes where the brightness modulated. Others commented that time seemed to stretch or contract, even though the footage itself was unaltered. Editors analyzing the feedback discovered that the luminance shifts interfered with the brain's adaptation to steady illumination, creating subtle cognitive strain. Studio executives questioned whether the effect was appropriate for wide release. While the brightness fluctuations were not overtly harmful, the unpredictable reactions raised concerns about viewer comfort and ethical transparency. Ultimately, Kelly was asked to reduce the intensity of the effect, though traces remain in several scenes, preserving the film's eerie, destabilizing feel. Hollywood quietly distanced itself from similar modulation techniques afterward. Internal discussions among post-production teams highlighted the risk of silent perceptual manipulation, visual methods that influenced emotional responses without conscious recognition. With the rise of digital mastering, these flicker-style overlays were removed from standard toolkits. Donnie Darko's lingering unease can still be felt today, and part of that atmosphere comes from this nearly invisible technique. It demonstrated that even the slightest disturbance in visual rhythm could alter the viewer's relationship with time, creating psychological echoes long after the film ends. 4. The Matrix, 1999. The Matrix transformed action filmmaking with bullet-time photography, but its earliest iterations were far more volatile than audiences ever saw. Before the final rig was perfected, the effects team relied on synchronized strobe flashes to mark each camera's exact position during motion capture rehearsals. When these strobes activated around actors, the resulting test footage captured bursts of rapid light pulses bleeding into the scene. During projection, these pulses manifested as hypnotic halos around moving figures, an effect visually fascinating but physically disorienting. Test viewers described difficulty tracking motion, dizziness, and a sensation that their visual field was bending. Technicians quickly realized that the rogue flicker fell into frequency ranges known to destabilize the neural pathways responsible for smooth motion interpretation. Though the effect was accidental, it demonstrated a risk the studio could not ignore. Warner Brothers quickly ordered the removal of all strobe-based calibration, replacing it with stabilized LED positional markers. Internal safety advisors noted that such flicker, especially when surrounding dynamic movement, could trigger sensory confusion, particularly in darkened theaters. While the public never saw these early tests, they prompted immediate internal guidelines discouraging any motion capture technique that produced rhythmic pulses during filming. The finished film showcased bullet time at its cleanest and most elegant, but its development history revealed a boundary Hollywood would not cross again. The experiments showed how easily groundbreaking innovation could drift into territory where visual rhythm interferes with neural processing. The Matrix ultimately revolutionized cinema, but it also buried a method that proved too neurologically destabilizing to survive. 5. Existence Z, 1999. Existenz explored virtual reality long before the concept became mainstream, and its visuals carried an unnerving quality that audiences struggled to articulate. Much of this came from a subtle distortion technique used throughout the film. Cronenberg's team experimented with variable frame shaping, warping the edges of motion paths and allowing certain movements to linger microscopically longer than the eye expects. These distortions were subtle enough to pass as natural, yet strange enough to unsettle the brain's internal sense of coherence. Viewers leaving early screenings often said they felt off balance without knowing why. Some experienced a mild dissociative sensation, as though the borders between objects were softening. Visual specialists later noted that inconsistent peripheral motion interferes with the brain's anchoring mechanisms, producing an instinctive discomfort similar to motion sickness precursors. Executives evaluating the technique questioned its safety. While nothing in the film was harmful, its unpredictability made industry professionals uneasy. The distortions did not behave consistently across all screen sizes or projection systems, meaning a scene that felt stable in one theater could become more intense in another. That lack of standardization convinced studios to discourage further experimentation with edge-warped motion. As Hollywood transitioned into fully digital effects, the priority shifted toward precision and visual stability. Existenz became an example cited in internal discussions, a reminder that even subtle disruptions in motion can induce unintended psychological effects. Today, the film remains iconic for its organic, unsettling mood, but the technique that contributed to that atmosphere has largely vanished from mainstream cinema. It demonstrated how easily visual distortion can bypass conscious analysis and whisper directly to the viewer's subconscious. 6. Event Horizon, 1997. Event Horizon has long been associated with its nightmarish visions, but what many viewers never realized is that the film incorporated one of Hollywood's most controversial subliminal techniques. During the construction of its violent hell montages, the editing team inserted micro-flashes of distorted imagery, fragments of screaming faces, twisted limbs, and chaotic movement lasting a single frame. These inserts were not meant to be consciously noticed. They were designed to register beneath awareness, producing unease the viewer could not easily explain. Reactions during early screenings were alarming. Audience members described sudden waves of anxiety or dread that seemed disproportionate to what was visible on screen. Some viewers felt their emotions had been hijacked, as if fear was being triggered without narrative cause. Editors reviewing the test feedback realized the subliminal frames were interacting with the brain's rapid response emotional centers, bypassing rational interpretation entirely. Studio executives grew uncomfortable with the idea of manipulating viewers on a subconscious level. Though the technique wasn't illegal, it was considered ethically precarious, particularly after internal advisors warned that subliminal content could yield unpredictable psychological effects. Paramount demanded the removal of several of the most extreme inserts, and internal guidelines circulated, advising future productions to avoid using subliminal frames in emotionally charged sequences. Even in its final cut, Event Horizon retains traces of this hidden method enough for attentive viewers to sense something disturbing, flickering, just beyond conscious recognition. But the controversy surrounding the film ensured that subliminal horror would never again appear so boldly in mainstream sci-fi. Event Horizon remains infamous for its imagery, yet its most influential legacy is the quiet abandonment of a technique that blurred the line between cinematic suggestion and psychological intrusion. 7. Tetsuo, The Iron Man, 1989. Tetsuo. The Iron Man pushed the boundaries of sensory cinema with its frantic editing and violently unstable camera work. Director Shinya Tsukamoto constructed movement using bursts of stop motion, handheld jitter, and fluctuating exposure cycles that made the imagery pulse like a living organism. Instead of smooth transitions, Tetsuo's world convulses frames, leap forward in jagged increments, objects warp under shifting light, and motion snaps unpredictably. These elements combine to form a visual rhythm closer to a panic response than traditional cinematography. Audiences at early screenings reacted intensely. Some felt vertigo or stomach unease. Others described a sensation that the room itself was vibrating. Critics at the time remarked that watching Tetsuo felt like enduring a physical event rather than observing a film. Technicians later noted that the erratic frame cadence closely resembled patterns used in psychological stress studies stimuli designed to disrupt the brain's ability to predict motion. Hollywood observed these reactions with caution. While the film was never intended for mainstream audiences, its techniques demonstrated that unstable motion patterns could induce involuntary physiological responses. Studios began informally categorizing such methods as non-compliant motion stress, advising cinematographers to avoid shot structures that created abrupt, rhythmic inconsistencies. By the early 1990 seconds, this effectively eliminated the use of aggressive stop-motion hybridity in commercial sci-fi. Tetsuo's legacy persists, not because the industry adopted its style, but because it stepped back from it. The film revealed how motion, when pushed to extremes, can overwhelm neural processing. Hollywood quietly concluded that this level of intensity crossed a threshold audiences were not prepared to endure. A10. Akira. Liventine Othin. Akira remains one of the most influential animated films ever produced, yet one of its most striking techniques nearly triggered an industry-wide reconsideration of strobe-based imagery. During several of the psychic attack sequences, the animation team deployed bursts of alternating light frames, rapid, high-intensity flashes designed to convey violent mental force. These sequences were crafted with artistic intent, but they extended into frequency ranges known to cause sensory strain, especially when viewed in darkened theaters on large screens. The reactions from early audiences were immediate. Some viewers experienced eye fatigue, while others felt momentary disorientation or a pressure behind the eyes. A few screenings reported small clusters of viewers turning away instinctively during the heaviest strobe sequences. Japanese distributors took notice, and while no formal warnings accompanied the release, projectionists in several cities were quietly told to adjust brightness levels to reduce the impact. International studios observing these patterns recognized the potential risk. Internal discussions emphasized that even brief exposure to rapid light alternation could provoke unpredictable neurological responses. As a result, many animation houses gradually abandoned extreme strobe frame cycles, favoring more controlled digital approaches that avoided pushing the perceptual threshold. What makes Akira's case notable is that the technique worked exactly as intended. It conveyed psychic violence by overpowering the senses, yet that effectiveness underscored its danger. The strobe rhythm destabilized the viewer's ability to process consecutive frames, mimicking the chaotic mental fragmentation depicted in the film. Today, Akira is revered for its ambition and aesthetic innovation, but its most aggressive optical methods have been largely retired. The film left behind a paradox. Its power came from a technique Hollywood determined was too physiologically disruptive to replicate. Tron, 1982. Tron is often celebrated for its pioneering digital aesthetic, but hidden behind its vibrant neon surfaces was a visual side effect that Hollywood quickly learned to avoid. During production, the film used a hybrid pipeline combining analog backlit animation with early computer-generated imagery. When these layers interacted, they produced unintended micro-flicker pulses, subtle flashes too rapid to be consciously registered, yet strong enough to interfere with the viewer's visual stability. These pulses emerged especially in scenes featuring glowing suits or high-contrast geometric patterns, where analog plates and digital frames overlapped imperfectly. Audiences in test screenings reported sensations ranging from lightheadedness to mild nausea. Some mentioned that the image seemed to ripple even though nothing on screen was actively moving. Engineers investigating the issue discovered that the unintentional flicker landed within a frequency range known to disrupt processing in the brain's motion detection pathways. While the effect was mild, its unpredictability concerned technicians. Identical sequences behaved differently depending on projection, brightness, or film stock. Disney quietly acknowledged the problem by revising compositing methods for subsequent releases. Internal notes from the era describe the hybrid flicker as incompatible with viewer comfort, marking it as a technical artifact to be eliminated in future workflows. Once fully digital pipelines became the norm, studios abandoned analog-digital interaction techniques entirely, not because they were obsolete, but because they revealed how sensitive the human perceptual system could be. Modern restorations have scrubbed away the instability, meaning contemporary viewers rarely experience the strange, pulsating edge of the original. But Tron's legacy includes more than groundbreaking visuals. It served as a warning that even small technical anomalies could intrude on neurological terrain Hollywood preferred not to explore. 10 Altered States, 1980. Altered States is frequently cited for its surreal hallucination sequences, but beneath its striking imagery lies a visual technique that raised alarms across multiple departments. Director Ken Russell incorporated bursts of high-contrast flicker intended to simulate neural overload as the protagonist undergoes sensory transformation. These flicker bursts alternated between light and shadow at speeds designed to overwhelm the viewer's perceptual system, mirroring the character's descent into primal consciousness. Screenings revealed just how potent the method could be. Some viewers felt momentary vertigo, while others described tingling sensations or difficulty focusing. A few audience members experienced brief dissociation, the very effect Russell sought to evoke. However, medical consultants brought in by the studio noted that the flicker cycles overlapped with frequencies used in neurological research, raising concerns about potential overstimulation, especially in audiences with sensitivities. While the film was not censored, studio leaders quietly insisted that future productions avoid flicker frequencies capable of destabilizing visual equilibrium. Hollywood's apprehension grew further as government agencies began issuing guidelines for strobe exposure in public spaces. The industry recognized it had wandered into territory where visual design could influence neural activity, not simply emotional tone. As digital editing matured, filmmakers moved away from aggressive flicker-based techniques. Altered States became a reference point during internal discussions, an example of how cinema could inadvertently mimic scientific procedures meant to induce altered states of consciousness. Despite these concerns, the film remains a daring exploration of human perception, but its approach to flicker effects left a mark Hollywood chose not to revisit. It demonstrated that visual repetition, when pushed to extremes, could affect the mind in ways the audience had no means to anticipate or control. Elf Eraserhead, 1977. Eraserhead is widely regarded as David Lynch's first major experiment in psychological immersion, yet few realize the film's most powerful effect came from its continuous, oppressive soundbed. Rather than rely on traditional musical cues, Lynch layered industrial drones, mechanical hums, and low-frequency resonances that created a sonic pressure chamber. These sounds operated as an environment rather than a score, an acoustic force that surrounded the viewer and subtly manipulated bodily responses. Audience reactions during early midnight screenings ranged from restlessness to full physical discomfort. Some viewers reported that their chest felt unusually tight, while others described a sensation of internal vibration. What unnerved many technicians was the consistency of these reactions despite the film's quiet pacing. Sound mixers later confirmed that certain resonant tones fell near ranges associated with anxiety and physiological stress. Hollywood took notice. While Lynch had not violated any artistic standard, the film inadvertently showcased how sustained low-frequency noise could function as a psychological lever. The unpredictability of audience responses made executives uneasy, particularly as reports grew of viewers experiencing symptoms unrelated to visual content. Studio notes from the period caution against using unmodulated industrial beds for theatrical release, citing their potential to provoke involuntary reactions. As sound technology advanced, mixing teams approached deep-frequency design with heightened caution. While low tones remained a staple of tension building, the kind of relentless resonance used in Eraserhead was quietly phased out. It was too consuming, too immersive, and too capable of triggering reactions that audiences could not explain. Eraserhead's soundscape still holds a hypnotic intensity, but it stands as a rare instance in which audio alone pushed mainstream cinema to reconsider its influence on the subconscious. The film didn't just unsettle viewers, it demonstrated how sound could bypass narrative entirely and communicate directly with the nervous system. 12. Phase 4, 1974. Phase 4 is often remembered for its surreal macro imagery, but the film also represents one of Hollywood's earliest brushes with biologically stressful optical techniques. Director Saul Bass relied heavily on experimental macro photography, illuminated by pulsing light sources that produced uneven exposure shifts. These shifts weren't the typical cinematic flicker, they occurred at inconsistent intervals that made the imagery oscillate between hyperclarity and sudden intensity spikes. Because the camera was focused on insect textures and movements, these pulses amplified every ripple, making the visuals feel invasive, almost predatory. Early audiences reacted in ways Bass did not anticipate. Some viewers reported eye tension or lightheadedness during the lab sequences. Others mentioned a crawling sensation on their skin, as if the film's microscopic details were breaching the boundary between the screen and their perception. Projectionists noted that even seasoned viewers looked away during certain pulsating shots, a behavior rarely triggered by non-violent imagery. Technicians analyzing the footage later discovered that the lighting variations aligned with ranges known to provoke visual fatigue. Hollywood grew cautious as complaints accumulated. The concern wasn't scandal, it was unpredictability. Irregular optical pulses could behave differently depending on projection equipment, meaning no two theaters presented the same physiological effect. Internal studio exchanges quietly labeled the method inconsistent for public exhibition, a polite way of warning that it skirted the edge of neurological interference. Bass defended his approach as a way to depict alien intelligence through sensory discomfort, but studios chose not to encourage further exploration. By the late 1970 seconds, macro-strobe combinations had all but vanished from mainstream productions. Phase 4 remains a striking work of speculative cinema, but buried in its visuals is a method Hollywood quietly agreed was too physiologically volatile to repeat. 13. Solaris, 1972. Tarkovsky's Solaris is celebrated for its contemplative pacing, but hidden within its serene surface is a subtle visual mechanism that deeply unsettled early audiences. Tarkovsky manipulated temporal flow using irregular frame loops, extended shutter durations, and micro-cadence variations. These disruptions weren't aggressive, they whispered rather than shouted. But the human brain is acutely sensitive to inconsistencies in motion. Even minor disturbances in frame rhythm can destabilize spatial awareness, producing sensations of drifting or emotional detachment. A prime example is the extended highway sequence, where motion appears normal yet somehow off. Viewers in initial screenings described feeling disoriented or ungrounded, even though nothing overtly threatening was on screen. Some critics interpreted these reactions as psychological responses to the film's philosophical themes, but projection technicians recognized that the cadence modulation played a direct role. The footage interfered with the brain's predictive processing, creating a faint vertigo that audiences struggled to articulate. Soviet authorities expressed quiet concern, questioning whether the cinematic technique was too intrusive. European distributors reported similar issues, noting clusters of viewers who reacted with unease during the film's temporal distortions. While no restrictions were imposed, studios gradually abandoned comparable experiments, wary that such subtle disruptions might be viewed as manipulative rather than artistic. Tarkovsky defended his methods, insisting cinema must reveal time's texture. But research conducted decades later confirmed what Solaris had already demonstrated. Irregular frame cadence can induce dissociative sensations, even at low intensity. Solaris survives as a masterpiece of meditative science fiction, but its technical legacy is one Hollywood silently distanced itself from. Tarkovsky's manipulation of time did more than deepen atmosphere, it approached the threshold of neurological intervention. 14. THX 11381971. George Lucas's THX 1138 is often praised for its sterile futurism, yet the film's most unsettling feature was not visual at all. Beneath its minimalist world, Lucas and sound designer Walter Murch embedded layers of infrasonic vibration tones below the threshold of conscious hearing, capable of influencing physiological responses. These frequencies were woven into ambient soundscapes, intensifying feelings of confinement and emotional suppression that defined the film's dystopian setting. During preview screenings, viewers reported sensations that appeared disproportionate to the imagery: tightening in the chest, shallow breathing, and a creeping anxiety that persisted through scenes with no explicit tension. A few audience members described a sense of being compressed, as though the environment in the theater had subtly shifted. Sound engineers later confirmed that these reactions aligned with known effects of prolonged low-frequency exposure, which can induce discomfort without the listener ever realizing the cause. Studio executives grew uneasy as theater managers began submitting complaints about unusual viewer reactions. While infrasonic sound was not banned, internal memos warned against using it in large-format releases due to unpredictability across sound systems. The concern wasn't only safety, it was the ethical ambiguity of triggering emotional states without the audience's awareness. Hollywood's risk management teams quietly urged productions to avoid deep-frequency beds unless strictly controlled. Lucas would move on to grander auditory frontiers, but THX 1138 remained a rare moment when a filmmaker explored the boundary between sound design and neurophysiology. As digital audio matured, sub-bass experimentation became more refined, yet the type of infrasonic layering used in THX never resurfaced at the same intensity. Today, THX 1138 is remembered as a bleak vision of humanity's future. But beneath its imagery lies a less discussed truth. The film used sound not just to build atmosphere, but to shape the viewer's internal state, an approach Hollywood quietly stepped away from. 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968. When Kubrick engineered the Stargate journey in 2001, A Space Odyssey, he wasn't attempting to shock audiences with spectacle, he was probing how far visual stimuli could push the human brain. The slit scan process he refined produced cascades of light and shifting geometry that pulsed with analog irregularity, generating perceptual stress uncommon for commercial cinema. These sequences weren't merely bright or abstract, they operated at flicker rhythms that strained the viewer's ability to stabilize orientation. As the patterns accelerated, the brain couldn't interpret depth or motion reliably, creating a momentary disconnect between sight and cognition. Reports from early screenings described an array of responses: trembling hands, a sensation of falling, or an emotional detachment that lingered beyond the film's runtime. Some viewers felt compelled to close their eyes, despite the absence of any overt discomfort. Studios initially interpreted these reactions as part of the film's psychedelic reputation, but internal correspondence revealed growing concerns that the imagery behaved more like a neurological trigger than a cinematic flourish. Medical advisors who reviewed footage noted that the slit scan pulses intersected with frequencies used in perceptual disorientation studies. Though no formal restriction was ever documented, executives quietly advised future productions to avoid comparable analog flicker sequences unless thoroughly controlled. Kubrick's experiment had shown that certain visual combinations possessed a potency that transcended art and approached manipulation. As cinema migrated toward digital workflows, the tactile instability of the Stargate effect became impossible to replicate. Modern remasters smooth out much of the analog harshness, muting the original physiological impact. What audiences experience today is a softened echo of a sequence once considered dangerously immersive. 2001 endures as a landmark achievement, but embedded within its legacy is a reminder: visual innovation can blur into neurological intrusion, and Hollywood prefers that boundary remain untouched. The history of these techniques reveals a side of filmmaking rarely acknowledged, one where innovation edges into territory that unsettles the body as much as the mind. Each method on this list demonstrated how easily cinema can reach beyond storytelling and into the viewer's neurological space, triggering reactions no studio could comfortably control. So the industry stepped back, quietly shelving tools that were too effective, too unpredictable, or simply too revealing of what visual and sonic stimuli can truly do. But buried experiments have a way of resurfacing. As technology advances and creative boundaries stretch, it's worth asking, will these forbidden techniques remain buried, or will someone, somewhere, decide to test them again?